And I've been committed to working for peace, and especially ending nuclear weapons, since the mid 60s. I was born on August 6th. And when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I found out the significance of the date August 6th in history. Not in a history class, but just in the history of the US. I also grew up in Lincolnton, North Carolina, which in 1960, the year of the census, the year after I was born in the summer of 59, there were just over 5,600 people living in that town. It was very rural, and about at that point, 6% of the population was African American. So just under 550 Black people in a town of 5,600 people. 70% of the population was white then. And there were yearly marches from the Klan. Working for peace wasn't exactly the language that I thought of back then, but standing for peace and understanding the importance of ending any kind of war was very important. So I was lucky given the life I was living. Not that it was a horrible life at all, but we were poor. We were the church's family of charity for a long time. And then being somebody who prioritized peace felt important. It also felt important to think beyond Lincolnton, North Carolina, where 5,600 people lived. Not that I knew the population then, but it felt small. And to think larger, not just larger than my city or my county or thinking beyond the Klan, but thinking around the globe to connect to people who suffered at our hands in 1945 when that bomb went off. In 2005, I got the honor of going to Japan during my birthday season. I even had Happy Birthday sang to me by over 10,000 people, 10,000 generous, beautiful Japanese people. And it was a sense and an experience I'll never forget. And it's hard to describe because of the sense of love and compassion among these folks that we wronged. And I felt that burden. As a person who grew up in poverty, as a Black woman in a fundamentally racist and white supremacist culture, being the person who represented the oppressor in that situation, it's the only word that makes sense to me. I felt that burden in a real way because I was representing the US when I was standing on that stage and people were singing my happy birthday to me. Even though I got to say in that speech that the US, in terms of creating terror and maintaining power, will lie, steal, and kill. I was really happy to be able to say that out loud to an audience of people. So working for UFPJ is just the most logical thing for me. Working to end nuclear weapons and the threat that nuclear weapons imposes on the planet is important to me. And being in relationship with the three people you'll hear from tonight is an honor and a blessing. You'll hear from Jackie Cabasso and John Burroughs and Andy Lichterman. Let me tell you a little bit about these folks who you'll be hearing from this night. Jackie is the executive director of the Western States Legal Foundation, which is in Oakland, and she has been since 1984. In 1995, Jackie was a founding mother of the Abolition 2000 Global Network to eliminate nuclear weapons. And she continues on its coordinating committee. Since 2007, Jackie served as executive advisor to Mayors for Peace. Jackie's also the co-coordinator of UFPJ. And in 2008, she received the International Peace Bureau's Sean McBride Award. After you hear from Jackie, you'll hear from John Burroughs. John is senior analyst for the New York-based Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy. He's represented the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy in nuclear non-proliferation treaty meetings and negotiations on the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. His articles and op-eds have appeared in publications including Fordham International Law Journal, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, Arms Control Today, Newsweek, and Newsday. After John, you'll hear from Andy Lichterman, who is a policy analyst and lawyer with the Oakland, California-based Western States Legal Foundation. Andy has represented peace and environmental justice activists in a variety of settings and also taught at alternative law schools for many years. He's a member of the United for Peace and Justice Coordinating Committee. Thank you again for being here this evening, this afternoon. Jackie. Jackie, you're still muted. Thanks.
Right, I'm trying to get my video on. There we go. Thank you, George. That was beautiful. Best introduction I think I've ever had. So before I begin, I'd like to thank Michael Waraska, who generously gave us permission to use his fantastic artwork to promote this webinar. I'd also like to mention that we have compiled a list of readings and other resources relating to this webinar that are available on the UFPJ website. The link will also be posted in the chat. I'm calling this part of my presentation Nukes 101. I'll be back after Andy speaks to add some thoughts on movement building. On August 6, 1945, the United States unleashed the nuclear age, dropping a single atomic bomb on Hiroshima, which indiscriminately incinerated tens of thousands of children, women, and men in an instant. It was a tiny and crude nuclear weapon by today's standards, justified by a lie of historic proportions that the bombing ended World War II and saved American lives. Over 90% of the doctors and nurses in Hiroshima were killed or injured by the bomb. 3 days later, the US dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. By the end of 1945, more than 210,000 people, mainly civilians, were dead, and the surviving A-bomb victims, or hibakusha, their children and grandchildren, continued to suffer from physical and psychological effects of the bombings. In 1995, then Hiroshima Mayor Takashi Hiraoka testified before the International Court of Justice, quote, "The bomb reduced Hiroshima to an inhuman state utterly beyond human ability to express or imagine. History is written by the victors," he concluded. "Thus, the heinous massacre that was Hiroshima has been handed down to us as a perfectly justified act of war. It is clear that the use of nuclear weapons, which cause indiscriminate mass murder that leaves survivors for decades, is a violation of international law." On July 7, 2017, I was at the United Nations in New York to witness the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or TPNW, by the majority of the world's countries. Watching countries vote by 122-1 to prohibit the possession, development, testing, use, and threat of nuclear weapons was a thrilling moment, but it was also bittersweet. After meeting the threshold of 50 ratifications, the TPNW entered into force on January 22nd of this year, becoming binding law on those countries that have ratified it. There are currently 54 states parties and 86 signatories. But the TPNW is not a panacea, and we need to take a hard look at nuclear realities as we plan our strategies going forward. We stand at a nuclear crossroads in a starkly divided world. While the TPNW represents the total repudiation of nuclear weapons by most of the states that don't possess them, the US and the 8 other nuclear armed states boycotted the negotiations, along with Japan, Australia, South Korea, and all but one of the 28 NATO member states, all countries under the US nuclear umbrella. In a joint statement following the vote, the US, France, and the United Kingdom declared, quote, "We do not intend to sign, ratify, or ever become party to the treaty. And here I want to note that the majority of the world's population lives in nuclear armed countries or countries under the US nuclear umbrella. And these are also the world's largest economies. It is important to understand that US national security policy has been remarkably consistent in the post-World War II and post-Cold War eras, despite dramatically changed geopolitical conditions and very different, to say the least, presidential styles. Deterrence, the threatened use of nuclear weapons, has been reaffirmed as the cornerstone of US national security by every president, Republican or Democrat, including Obama, since 1945, when President Harry Truman, a Democrat, oversaw the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In October 2016, President Obama's UN Ambassador Robert Wood condemned the TPNW in the General Assembly. Quote, advocates of a ban treaty say it is open to all, but how can a state that relies on nuclear weapons for its security possibly join a negotiation meant to stigmatize and eliminate them? Today, an estimated 13,125 nuclear weapons, most an order of magnitude more powerful than the US atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 91% of them held by the United States and Russia, continue to pose an intolerable threat to humanity, and the dangers of wars among nuclear armed states are growing. The other nuclear armed states are France, China, the UK, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea. And Iran does not have nuclear weapons. The detonation of even a small number of these weapons could have catastrophic human and environmental consequences that could affect everyone on the planet. Over the next 30 years, the US plans to spend roughly $2 trillion to replace its entire nuclear weapons infrastructure and upgrade or replace its nuclear bombs and warheads and the bombers, missiles, and submarines that deliver them. All 9 nuclear armed nations are upgrading their nuclear arsenals. Dangerous and destabilizing US plans include a new air-launched cruise missile with long-range standoff capability that will be stealthier, more accurate, longer range, and deployed in the hundreds on a new stealth bomber, the B-2. A new land-based intercontinental ballistic missile called the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent with an enhanced W-817 warhead to replace the 400 Minuteman III missiles currently deployed on the Great Plains. 12 new replacement Trident ballistic missile submarines. Trident submarine-launched ballistic missiles are undergoing life extensions, and the mated W-76 warhead has been made much more accurate. An entirely new warhead, the W-93, is planned for deployment by 2040. With up to 20,000 existing plutonium pits, the triggers of nuclear weapons, in storage at the Pantex plant in Texas, the US is planning to upgrade plutonium pit manufacturing capacity at the Los Alamos National Lab in New Mexico to 30 or more pits per year, and at the Savannah River site in Georgia to 50 or more pits per year by 2030. The US also plans to build a new uranium processing facility at the Y-12 plant in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and to continue to use 2 older facilities there for 30 more years. These facilities will be used to manufacture highly enriched uranium components called secondaries, which put the H in H-bomb, for refurbished and new design nuclear weapons at a rate of 80 units per year. Russian President Vladimir Putin, in a 2018 speech, boasted about new invincible Russian nuclear weapons and gave a detailed description, complete with video animations, of an array of new nuclear weapon delivery systems, including a nuclear-powered cruise missile and an underwater drone. In September 2020, the Pentagon claimed that China plans to double its stockpile of nuclear weapons from 290 in this decade, including those designed to be carried by ballistic missiles that can reach the United States. This February, France announced plans to launch a full-scale development phase of a new program to build France's 3rd generation of nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. The French Minister for the Armed Forces, Florence Parly, described the new nuclear submarine as, quote, a program that fully embodies the long time of our defense. The first 3rd generation ballistic missile submarine will be delivered in 2035, followed by one submarine every 5 years. And these will sail until 2090. Still quoting, in other words, the last sailors who will patrol on board the third generation ballistic missile submarines are not born yet. Chilling, chilling. On March 16th, Prime Minister Boris Johnson released an integrated defense review that calls for increasing the UK's nuclear stockpile ceiling from the earlier goal of 180 by the mid-2020s to as many as 260, a 44% increase. The defense review vaguely justifies the increase in the nuclear warhead cap, quote, in recognition of the evolving security environment, end quote, and in response to, quote, a developing range of technological and doctrinal threats. These disquieting developments are contrary to the 1970 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, the only binding commitment in a multilateral treaty to the goal of disarmament by the 5 original nuclear armed states. Article 6 spells out the disarmament obligation, quote, each of the parties to the treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. The NPT's disarmament obligations, enshrined in the preamble in Article 6, have been reiterated and reinforced by agreements made in connection with the 1995 extension decision, the 2000 and 2010 review conferences, and the International Court of Justice's 1996 advisory opinion, which provided the authoritarian interpretation of Article 6. The court found unanimously, quote, there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control. However, the failure of the nuclear armed states to make good on their disarmament obligations, and to the contrary, in the face of new arms racing, the long-term viability of the NPT is being questioned. The 5-year NPT review conference that had been scheduled for May 2020, the 50th anniversary of the treaty, was postponed due to the pandemic and has been rescheduled for August 2021. It will come at a critical time in the international nuclear discourse. According to United Nations High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Izumi Nakamitsu, quote, the specter of unconstrained nuclear competition looms over us for the first time since the 1970s. We are witnessing what has been termed a qualitative nuclear arms race, one not based on numbers, but on faster, stealthier, and more accurate weapons. Regional conflicts with a nuclear dimension are worsening, and proliferation challenges are not receding, end quote. With rising geopolitical tensions, an alarming but often overlooked trend is the increased scale and tempo of war games by nuclear armed states and their allies, including nuclear drills. Ongoing missile tests and frequent close encounters between military forces of nuclear armed states, including the US and Russia, the US and China, and India and Pakistan, exacerbate nuclear dangers. Given the global stakes, it's hard to understand how the subject of nuclear weapons was entirely absent from the 2020 presidential campaign. So what can we expect from the Biden administration? Joe Biden has been involved in arms control negotiations since 1979. Shortly before leaving office in 2017, Vice President Biden said, quote, it is precisely because we do not trust our adversaries that treaties to constrain the human capacity for destruction are indispensable to the security of the United States of America. Arms control is integral to our national defense, and when it comes to nuclear weapons, to our self-preservation, end quote. But he added a familiar refrain, quote, a nuclear deterrent has been the bedrock of our national defense since World War II. And so long as other countries possess nuclear weapons that could be used against us, we too must maintain a safe, secure, and effective nuclear arsenal to deter attacks against ourselves and our allies. That is why early in the Obama administration, we increased funding to maintain our arsenal and modernize our nuclear infrastructure so that our arsenal remains safe and reliable, even with fewer weapons and even without tests, end quote. When pondering why nuclear weapons persist, consider this. On February 1st of this year, warning that the danger of nuclear war with Russia or China is, quote, a very real possibility, end quote, Admiral Charles Richard, Chief of U.S. Strategic Command, described the relationship between nuclear and conventional weapons in current U.S. warfighting plans. Quote, "We must acknowledge the foundational nature of our nation's strategic nuclear forces as they create the maneuver space for us to project conventional military power strategically." So now I will turn the floor over to John.
Well, thank you, Jackie. You set up my remarks very nicely, and I appreciate United for Peace and Justice having me on tonight, and also George's magnificent introduction. So international law is my subject. International law is a many-sided human creation. Today, I will take one important aspect, multilateral lawmaking, and examine US resistance to it, the consequences in the nuclear weapons sphere, and what can be done about it. To understand our current predicament, I'll begin with the most recent period of vigorous multilateralism, the 1990s. Negotiations on the most comprehensive ever weapons treaty, the Chemical Weapons Convention, were completed in 1993, and the treaty entered into force in 1997. That year, the Senate approved ratification, though with some conditions that seemed incompatible with the treaty. While perhaps not operatively significant, the conditions and the tough battle for ratification were a signal that clear sailing was not ahead for multilateralism. And indeed, that is the last major multilateral treaty the United States has entered into. 2 years later, the Senate refused to approve ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. As Jackie mentioned, in 1995, a legally binding agreement not requiring ratification was reached to extend the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty indefinitely. In connection with that decision, a number of commitments were adopted, among them completion of negotiations on the Test Ban Treaty by 1996, negotiation of a fissile material cutoff treaty, practical steps towards establishment of a WMD free zone for the Middle East, and, I underline this last one, systematic and progressive efforts to reduce nuclear arsenals with the ultimate objective of their elimination. Except for the CTBT commitment, the commitments have essentially not been fulfilled. In 1996, negotiations were completed on the Test Ban Treaty. As a price for pursuing US negotiation of and participation in the treaty, the Clinton administration committed to funding of extensive modernization and development of the US nuclear weapons infrastructure, known as the Stockpile Stewardship Program. Despite that program, as mentioned in 1999, the Senate refused to approve ratification. That was a hard body blow to the nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament regime. The CTBT had been regarded as key to control of nuclear weapons for decades, is the only measure referred to in the NP preamble, and as I've noted, was highlighted in the 1995 extension of the NPT. Also in 1996, the International Court of Justice delivered its advisory opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. While the United States strongly opposed the UN General Assembly's request for the opinion, the US did participate in the arguments before the court. The court found that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is generally contrary to international humanitarian law, forbidding the infliction of indiscriminate harm and unnecessary suffering in warfare. The court declined to assess the legality of use of low-yield nuclear weapons in remote areas and of use of nuclear arms in reprisal against a nuclear attack or when a state's survival is endangered. While the court's opinion thus was not definitive, it is also fair to say that the thrust of its reasoning was toward illegality in all circumstances. Now, relevant to my subject today, the court also held unanimously interpreting Article 6 of the NPT, as Jackie said, that there's an obligation to pursue and conclude negotiations on nuclear disarmament. This is a powerful affirmation of the centrality of multilateralism to leaving the nuclear age behind. It has been welcomed by most countries, but not by the Western nuclear powers, the US, UK, and France, or by Russia. More importantly, the nuclear powers have not acted in accordance with the court's holding, nor with the similar commitment made in connection with the 1995 NPT extension decision. Led by its indomitable foreign minister, Tony DeBruym, in 2014, the Marshall Islands sought to hold the nuclear armed states accountable to a disarmament obligation before the court, but by a narrow margin, the court declined to consider the question. Now I'm going to go slightly outside the nuclear sphere. The final piece in the 1990s surge of multilateralism was the 1998 negotiation of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The United States participated in the negotiations and made positive contributions, such as the inclusion of gender-related crimes, while also diluting certain war crimes elements. An effort was made to include a specific prohibition of use of nuclear weapons, but that was rebuffed by the US and other states. A last act of the Clinton administration was to sign the treaty. However, under the guidance of John Bolton, the G.W. Bush administration withdrew the US signature. While the Obama administration in certain respects took a constructive attitude toward the International Criminal Court, at no time since the Rome Statute was negotiated has US ratification been on the table. The ICC is important or potentially important in many ways. Regarding nuclear arms, its provisions on crimes against humanity and war crimes are fundamentally incompatible with the use of those weapons. So, to summarize, the turn against multilateralism was signaled by the difficulty of obtaining Senate approval of ratification of the Chemical Weapons Convention. It became entrenched with the Senate's refusal to consent to ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1999. Another important manifestation I have not yet mentioned is that John Bolton led US disruption and termination of negotiation of a verification protocol, which is a treaty, to the Biological Weapons Convention in 2003. And the US, along with UK, France, and Russia, showed no interest in negotiation of a nuclear weapons convention comparable to the Chemical Weapons Convention. So this webinar is supposed to be about causes. That's a hard question, but what factors do we see in play here? Well, we see post-Cold War triumphalism. We see an attitude that, especially in the post-Cold War era, there should be no restrictions on US power. That was viewed as diminishing US security rather than expanding it through a paradigm of cooperative security. So in this new environment of US, or at least Senate, resistance to multilateralism, there have been two key developments. One is that the Obama administration resorted to negotiating agreements that could be claimed under US law not to be treaties and therefore not subject to Senate approval. Thus, the Paris Climate Agreement was characterized in US law as an executive agreement. To accommodate the US, it was a combination of procedural requirements, hold meetings, make reports, with substantive goals, but not legally binding substantive requirements. The Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, was creatively written so that it did not explicitly convey that the parties were taking on legally binding obligations. It was framed more like a plan of action. In both cases, the claim that the agreement is not a treaty is questionable. Well, the second development is that other states have gone ahead with negotiating treaties regardless of whether the US participates in negotiations or is expected to join the treaty in the near to midterm. That was true with the treaties banning landmines and cluster munitions. And those treaties, certainly the one on landmines, have developed international norms whose force is felt by countries like the US not party to the treaty. The same approach was taken with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, whose proponents were in part inspired by the landmines and cluster munitions agreements. Let me make a few comments on the TPNW, which, as Jackie said, entered into force earlier this year. At least from an optimistic point of view, the TPNW manifests a paradigm shift toward human-centered security, away from security based on states' interactions. Legally, this is expressed by the preamble's affirmation of international humanitarian law governing the conduct of warfare and of especially international human rights law. The paradigm shift is also visible by the inclusion, for the first time in a nuclear weapons related treaty, of obligations of assistance to victims of nuclear testing and use and of environmental remediation. The TPNW is grounded in the NPT and other international law and is a powerful statement of the humanitarian and legal principles that should guide the non-use and abolition of nuclear arms. It was negotiated in 2017. A year later, another important statement was made by the UN Human Rights Committee. It found that I'm going to quote, the threat or use of weapons of mass destruction, in particular nuclear weapons, which are indiscriminate in effect and are of a nature to cause destruction of human life on a catastrophic scale, is incompatible with respect for the right to life and may amount to a crime under international law. So the TPNW and the human rights finding are valuable resources for advocacy of those principles and values in the United States. The TPNW's present operative significance in the US is doubtful. For the US to join the treaty, it would have to either engage in unilateral nuclear disarmament or engage in a process of verified elimination of nuclear arsenals with other nuclear powers that would enable the US and those states to join the treaty together. And it should be said, if the US, Russia, China, and other nuclear powers engaged in a disarmament process resulting in global zero, as they are obligated to do by the NPT and international law, they still might not join the TPNW. It is not an option for the US to sign, but not ratify the treaty. Under international law, a signatory is obligated to refrain from acts which would defeat the object and purpose of the treaty. In the case of the CTBT, which bans nuclear explosive tests, it makes sense for the US to be a signatory, since it is not conducting such tests. In the case of the TPNW, which bans, among other things, possession, threat, and use of nuclear weapons, the US would be constantly engaging in acts contrary to the TPNW's object and purpose, absent a very, very dramatic change in its nuclear weapons policies and practices, leading to elimination of the US arsenal in the near term. So what can be done to advance nuclear disarmament in light of the entrenched opposition to multilateralism in the US? Well, first of all, there's bilateral arms control with Russia, assuming Russia is willing to engage in light of its concerns about overall US military capabilities. Possibly too, there could be arms control, extension of arms control to China and perhaps other nuclear powers. Secondly, the US can and should take steps on its own to reduce drastically the number and role of its nuclear weapons, regardless of what other nuclear powers do. Unfortunately, it has become a habit to assume that the US posture must move in sync with that in particular of Russia. Moreover, the same forces that oppose multilateralism will likely oppose such unilateral steps. Having said that, there are signs that the Pentagon is more interested in developing its non-nuclear than its nuclear capabilities, though it is certainly committed to maintaining and upgrading existing nuclear forces. 3, concerning the high barrier of 2/3 of the Senate having to approve ratification of treaties, it must first be understood that this problem goes beyond the nuclear sphere. We have seen it in the climate arena and in others as well. For example, the Law of the Sea Convention. Its ratification is supported by the US Navy, but that's not enough. The problem of the 2/3 majority is compounded by the well-known fact that rural, less populated states are overrepresented in the Senate. One solution, of course, would be a wholesale change in the membership of the Senate, or a return of the Republican Party or a significant faction of it to supporting a rules-based international order. Absent that, for multilateral agreements, it may be necessary to continue to rely on the sort of creative approach displayed regarding the JCPOA or the Paris Agreement, or for that matter, NAFTA, which was called not a treaty, but a congressional executive agreement. As to nuclear weapons and other acute global challenges, solutions must be found, and we must be willing to think creatively and differently. My current assessment is this: we should work for fundamental changes in US society and politics that would naturally support a constructive attitude towards participating in global, cooperative global institutions. And Jackie will have more to say about this at the end. And we should support further US nuclear arms reductions along with limits on non-nuclear capabilities like missile defense to make nuclear reductions possible from a Russian point of view. And we should support the broadening of nuclear arms control to include China and other nuclear powers. Andy, over to you.
Well, good evening. As Jackie documented in depth, prospects for disarmament are going in the wrong direction. Tensions among nuclear-armed states are on the rise. All of the nuclear-armed countries are modernizing their nuclear arsenals. They also are engaged in broad-spectrum conventional arms racing that makes confrontation among nuclear-armed militaries more dangerous. Despite this, there are no mass movements for nuclear disarmament in any of the nuclear-armed states. So I think it's worthwhile to pause and to assess our approaches to disarmament work and the challenges we face. I'll be providing more questions than answers tonight. My hope is perhaps to shake loose some new thinking. I've chosen a few common approaches and arguments to talk about. One theme runs throughout. How do we understand how cause and effect works in society? How do we understand what is driving arms racing and the risk of war among nuclear-armed countries? How will we build enough collective power to do something about it and to make progress towards the kind of world in which abolition of nuclear weapons is possible? This exercise may not feel very uplifting, so perhaps bear in mind the old maxim, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. The first approach I want to consider is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which has been talked about already this evening. The treaty was a considerable achievement, perhaps the best that could be accomplished given the circumstances. But the circumstances included the absence of mass movements for disarmament, and most of all, the absence of significant disarmament movements in the nuclear-armed states. Now that the TPNW is a reality, we need to think anew about the kind of role it might play. The first thing to note is that for the most part, treaties are not causes of major changes of government policy. Rather, they're effects. They mark decisions already made by governments, bargains that governments have chosen to accept. Treaties are not very likely to play a causal role in building the support needed to bring about major social change. Before you can persuade people to care about a treaty to abolish nuclear weapons, they have to have reasons to care about nuclear weapons. The second thing to note is that words on paper aren't enough. Much discussion around the TPNW focuses on developing the norm against possession and use of nuclear weapons. What does it take to make a normative vision a legal reality? Legal historian Robert Cover wrote that the creation of legal meaning cannot take place in silence, but neither can it take place without the committed action that distinguishes law from literature. Thinking about the commitment necessary to incarnate a normative vision helps us to understand the nature of the task. The relationship between law and commitment is worth thinking about on several levels. It's a way to think about what it means for a country to join the TPNW. It is also a way to think about what it means for a town or a city to take some kind of action on nuclear disarmament, such as a statement supporting the treaty. The less concrete the action you demand, the less risk there is for the decision makers involved. Hence, the less commitment is required, both on the part of those making the decisions and on the part of those making the demands. It's relatively easy to get a liberal city to pass a resolution endorsing a disarmament treaty the city itself has now no power to join. It's hard to get even a liberal city to take concrete action to stop weapons factories or deployments that might bring their city money and jobs. And there's no guarantee that the easy gets, the low-hanging fruit of politics, lead to anything more substantial. Paying lip service, performative acts that cater to one or another constituency with little commitment or cost are a large part of what politicians do. The more concrete the commitment we ask of a government, the more collective power we must organize to obtain it. Intermediate goals that don't require us to organize more broadly, to extend our reach, to build new alliances, don't take us very far if our goals require substantial change in the order of things. At the national level, the degree of commitment manifested by joining the TPNW differs greatly depending on a state's relationship with nuclear weapons. It's relatively easy to get a country that already has forsworn nuclear weapons to join a nuclear disarmament treaty. It is much, much harder to get a nuclear-armed government to decide to join a treaty that requires them to eliminate their nuclear arsenal. The level of commitment that would be demonstrated by a nuclear-armed country joining the TPNW would be very high. So too would the level of commitment, the mobilization of social power in their population needed to make it happen. I was looking back at some issues of the Journal of European Nuclear Disarmament to remind myself about the size of the Cold War era disarmament movements. In Germany alone, by 1985, there were estimated to be around 4,000 local peace groups. More than 5 million people, about 8% of the total population, had signed appeals protesting NATO's planned deployment of nuclear-armed missiles in Europe. 8% of the US population today would be about 26 million people. The European peace movements likely played a role in bringing about the INF Treaty, ending the deployment of particularly dangerous intermediate-range missiles deployed by the United States and the Soviet Union. And those movements may have played some role in bringing an end to the Cold War and in reducing war risk. These were no small achievements, yet these movements, plus similar movements across the US and the world, were not enough to impel the nuclear-armed states to engage in serious negotiations to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. The huge movements in Europe were not enough to cause the removal of all US nuclear weapons from Europe, even after the Cold War had ended, where they remained deployed today. And both France and Great Britain still have substantial nuclear arsenals as well. All of this suggests there is no one-size-fits-all strategy for nuclear disarmament work. And it also gives us an idea of the magnitude of the task before us. Reducing the risk of war and moving towards a world without nuclear weapons likely will require broad, sustained social movements. We will need to make connections with people working on other aspects of building a more fair, democratic, and sustainable society. One set of approaches long used by anti-war and disarmament activists to build connections with other struggles focuses on military spending and the economic power of the military-industrial complex. It's worth re-examining this approach in light of the changing role of the military and the arms industries in the economy. Perhaps the most common tactic for this is guns versus butter arguments, comparing the cost of war and preparation for war to other forms of public spending. Regarding the guns versus butter arguments, one question we should be asking is, why haven't they worked? Over the decades, there has been a lot of excellent work done documenting the costs of war and preparation for war. There are also lots of smart people working in movements and organizations that advocate for more resources to serve human needs, like healthcare, education, and housing. If there is really a huge pool of public money out there, the military budget, and if it's reasonably possible to move that money from military spending to human needs, why haven't more of those organizations taken up the call to do so? One possible answer is that those organizations understand that it's really hard to cut military spending, and there may be easier pots of money to go after. A very modest financial transactions tax, sufficiently mainstream to have been included a couple of years ago in a Congressional Budget Office list of revenue options, would raise more than $70 billion per year, more than the estimated annual cost of maintaining and modernizing the US nuclear arsenal. The Trump tax cuts were a political choice that resulted in an annual loss of revenue estimated at $275 billion, over a third of the annual military budget. Which is it easier to imagine, reversing the Trump tax cuts or cutting the military budget by a third? Why is it so hard to cut military spending? One answer commonly given is the economic power of the military-industrial complex. But by most measures, the purely economic power of the military and the arms industry has declined significantly from Cold War peaks. From the 1970s onward, military spending as a percentage of gross domestic product trended steadily downward, reaching a low of about 3% in the 1990s. The military budget increased significantly in the 2000s, but it still has not approached peak Cold War shares of the US economy. Reductions of the military budget during the 1990s were accompanied by a consolidation in the arms industry, and also by several rounds of closures of US domestic military bases. Both reduced the pervasive geographic and economic presence of the military and the arms industry. The Defense Department's role in science and technology research and development also has declined since the Cold War. And regarding the cruder ways economic power translates into political power, like lobbying and campaign expenditures, the arms sector does not appear to rank anywhere near the top. The immense US military establishment clearly serves and is supported politically by a far greater array of deeply rooted interests than the military-industrial complex alone. We need to understand the forces in the US and elsewhere that is driving the resurgence of arms racing and confrontation among nuclear-armed countries. A key to mobilizing for peace and disarmament in this moment is educating publics about the renewed danger of nuclear war. Most important is that we try to understand the dynamics of the global economic and political system right now. E.P. Thompson, a historian and one of the founders of European nuclear disarmament, warned against understanding the present through easy analogies with the past. He was writing during the depths of the Cold War. Then, politicians and ideologists, both East and West, invoked the image of the Nazis to paint their adversaries as dangerous aggressors and any appeasement as fatal error. It is a compelling identification, Thompson wrote, yet it rests on the assent of memory rather than upon analysis or evidence. It appears plausible simply because it looks so familiar. This time around, it is the Cold War rivalry that provides the familiar and powerful imagery with which to portray the present. And it is just as important today to avoid skipping over the difficult analysis for the easy trope. To be sure, the mainstream commentators and government officials are providing ample fodder for the new Cold War discourse. And the main antagonists, once more, are the old Cold War adversaries, the US, Russia, and China. But arguing within the Cold War frame, even by saying no new Cold War, I believe helps to reinforce that frame. And it obscures the actual nature of the new and likely very dangerous confrontations among nuclear-armed governments and their militaries. Cold War analogies push propaganda buttons wired long ago. They add resonance to the rhetoric from the right that China and Russia are communist states, which neither really are today. Cold War analogies reinforce the message from the national security establishment that this new confrontation once again is a collision between starkly different ways of ordering the economy and the relation of the economy to the state. But what we really have now is a competition within one system, a struggle for ascendance in a global capitalism that now encompasses the entire planet. To understand this new round of great power competition, we also need to do more than say, it's imperialism, a term that too often now has little more analytic content than stuff the US and its allies do that we don't like. Some key potential flashpoints are not easily understood through a simple anti-imperialist lens. This is so even where the boundaries and political unions involved are in significant ways legacies of colonialism, for example, Taiwan or India and Pakistan. Traditionally, imperialism was understood as a form of competition, rooted in the dynamics of the global capitalist system. Today, at least here in the United States, I seldom see discussion of imperialism as a competitive system. This is so despite the fact that there are no major powers left that are not thoroughly enmeshed in global capitalist markets and in the forms of competition that entails. And this competition is taking new forms under new conditions. Unprecedented ecological stresses are driving conflict both within and among countries. With the entire world now part of the global capitalist circuit of trade and investment, there are fewer opportunities for the kind of accumulation by dispossession available to competing states that characterized past forms of colonialism and imperialism. Nationalisms also are playing a greater role in today's great power antagonisms than they did during the Cold War. We are seeing resurgent blood and soil nationalisms, not just in the United States, but in many countries. And with the Biden administration, we might be seeing not a return to liberal internationalism, but a new liberal nationalism. It has strands of the US as a nation of immigrants, resonances of the New Deal, restoration of US technological supremacy, the rule of law with a strong emphasis on the kinds of law that protects US markets and foreign investment. Nationalist competition will be intensified by conflating economic issues with national security challenges. Competition with China for economic dominance will play out on such terrain as intellectual property protection, technology standards, and the flow of digital information, all portrayed as central to the security threat presented by a rising China and a resurgent Russia. Understanding how nationalisms are formed and manipulated as elements of strategies of rule is particularly important in this moment. Nationalisms also are where the effects of foreign policy are most likely to resonate at home, erupting as discrimination and violence against immigrants and other vulnerable communities. This is one of the places that peace movements and the new movements emerging from the communities on the front line here at home intersect. If I thought that disarmament progress depended only on the people and organizations currently working for disarmament, I would have long since given up hope. But it doesn't, and it never has. I believe all work that strives to bend the arc towards justice, towards a world that is more fair, more democratic, and more ecologically sustainable, also reduces the risk of war. Peace movements have been most successful in moments when they were immersed in broader, deeper movements challenging a violent, inequitable, and unsustainable status quo. And we are in a time of growing new movements. Recently, Amna Akbar, a law professor whose work focuses on the emerging social movements, wrote, "We are living in a time of grassroots demands to transform our built environment and our relationships with one another and the earth, to abolish prisons and police, rent, debt, and borders, and billionaires, to decommodify housing and healthcare, and to decolonize land, to exercise more collective ownership over collectively generated wealth. Some of us are reimagining the state. Others are dreaming of moving beyond it. But these are more than dreams. These are the demands for a democratic political economy. Peace, an end of war and militarism, is the piece that is still missing from that list of demands. Our challenge is to be able to understand our place among these new movements, to be able to explain to ourselves and our potential allies why in this moment we are all part of the same struggle. And Jackie will give you some more ideas along these lines. Jackie?
Thank you, Andy. Hello again. So I am going to look back for a moment before looking forward. I'm going to start with a quote from Martin Luther King from 1964. He said, "Somehow we must transform the dynamics of the world power struggle from the negative nuclear arms race, which no one can win, to a positive contest to harness man's creative genius for the purpose of making peace and prosperity a reality for all of the nations of the world. In short, we must shift the arms race into a peace race." On June 21st, 1982, at the conclusion of the United Nations Second Special Session on Disarmament, 1 million people rallied in New York City's Central Park, calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons, and huge solidarity demonstrations took place around the world. That day, I was among some 1,500 people arrested nonviolently blocking the gates to the Livermore Nuclear Weapons Lab, one of 2 US laboratories that have designed and developed all US nuclear weapons and continue to do so. The other is, of course, Los Alamos Lab in New Mexico, the site of the original Manhattan Project. A comparable demonstration a year later led to my 1983 group trial with others, and I note that the other 2 speakers were among my lawyers, and a third lawyer is in the participants list. In that trial, more than 35 years ago, we presented an international law defense contending not only that nuclear weapons are illegal under numerous international treaties banning genocide, mass poisoning, and targeting civilian populations, but that the Nuremberg Charter, ratified by the US, mandates a right of resistance to international law violations. In the 1980s, fear of nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union was palpable, and it was at the top of most people's minds in the US and around the world. But coming on the heels of the many civil rights movements, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the women's movement, the gay liberation movement, and the ecology movement, the massive anti-nuclear movement that arose was not single issue. One need only look at the 61-page Livermore Weapons Lab Blockade Demonstration Handbook prepared by the Livermore Action Group for the June 21st, 1982 Nonviolent Protest and Civil Disobedience at the lab. The first point in the statement of purpose reads, "The ultimate goal of the Livermore Action Group is to further the cause of global nuclear disarmament, the demilitarization of American society, and a redirection of economic priorities that provides for a more equitable distribution of wealth and resources at home and abroad. The handbook includes extensive background on the lab, its role in driving the nuclear arms race and nuclear testing in Nevada, the effects of a nuclear weapons use, the radiation and health safety. It calls out the role of the lab's management, the University of California, in lobbying for new nuclear weapons. It stresses the inextricable link between nuclear weapons and nuclear power and advocates for conversion of the lab to research on safe energy alternatives. The handbook devotes a full page to the 1961 UN General Assembly resolution on the prohibition of nuclear warfare, quoting from the resolution that the use of nuclear weaponry, quote, would exceed even the scope of war and cause indiscriminate suffering and destruction to mankind and civilization, and as such is contrary to the rules of international law and to the laws of humanity, end quote. Noting that this resolution was adopted by more than 2/3 of the General Assembly's membership, and that, quote, the United States voted against it in the General Assembly and has opposed efforts to withdraw legitimacy from nuclear weapons, end quote, the article concludes, the first use and first strike nuclear weapons that are being developed at Livermore and Los Alamos are in direct violation of international law. An article entitled U.S. Militarism, the War at Home and Abroad is prefaced with, quote, many people opposed to nuclear weapons see the problem as a symptom of a pervasive militarism in American policy with far-reaching implications for all world citizens. And it begins, quote, the US is at war. It has been in a state of war or war preparedness for over 4 decades. Soon the Reagan administration's yearly spending will surpass the peak budget of the Vietnam War. The handbook includes a history of nonviolent direct action, a discussion of the dynamics and politics of nonviolence, and nonviolent direct action guidelines. There is a discussion of feminism and overcoming masculine oppression, and information about forming affinity groups and making decisions by consensus. The 1983 version of the handbook added a discrimination introduction, quote, in the disarmament movement, it is important not only to struggle against bombs and missiles, but also to struggle against other forms of violence that confront us. 2 forms of violence, racism and homophobia, are strongly interconnected with the creation of weapons of destruction. After all, it is the same system that is responsible, a system based on domination, on the belief that some people have more value than others, and therefore have the right to control others. Because we believe it is the system and all of its forms of violence that we are fighting, we must make a commitment to fight the violence that occurs around us and between us. Despite the massive international anti-nuclear movement, following the end of the Cold War, nuclear weapons fell off the public's radar screen. It was almost as if the planet itself breathed a huge sigh of relief. People around the world hoped and believed that they had escaped a nuclear holocaust and largely put nuclear weapons out of their minds. Most people believed that the threat of nuclear war had ended, but it hadn't and it hasn't. It is increasingly clear that the multiple national and global crises we are confronting, including nuclear weapons, climate change, systemic racism, a growing wealth gap, and rising national authoritarianisms, arise from the same foundational causes, and that we are unlikely to prevail on any of them as single issues. We need to come together as never before to build political power through durable, diverse, multi-issue coalitions, networks, and networks of networks based on our shared commitments to universal, indivisible human security. There is an emerging movement that I believe has the vision and potential to bring together such a coalition and to build powerful political pressure from the bottom up. It's the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Exactly 1 year before his tragic assassination in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. declared, I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. The Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, has picked up Dr. King's unfinished work, weaving the interlocking injustices of systemic racism, systemic poverty, environmental devastation, militarism and the war economy, and a distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism into one moral fusion campaign. The Poor People's Campaign moral budget calls for cutting US military spending by half, $350 billion, including by closing 60% of US foreign military bases, ending the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere, and, I underscore this, dismantling and eliminating nuclear weapons. With active state-based organizations in 46 states, the burgeoning Poor People's Campaign is being supported by an extraordinary range of constituencies, including labor unions, faith organizations, racial justice, anti-poverty, environmental, and peace groups, and is building political power through its We Must Do More campaign, mobilizing, organizing, registering, and educating for a movement that votes. United for Peace and Justice is proud to be a national mobilizing partner with the Poor People's Campaign, and I urge everyone to find out more about the campaign and consider joining your state's Poor People Campaign organization. As nuclear disarmament advocates, it is our responsibility to share our knowledge of the ever-present and growing dangers of nuclear war with other issue constituencies. Let us work together to understand the common causes of our multifaceted crises as we work with the Poor People's Campaign and others to build the massive, multi-generational, multiracial, international moral fusion movement we will need to overcome systemic violence and build a peaceful, just, sustainable, and inclusive world. As Gandhi observed, the moral to be legitimately drawn from the supreme tragedy of the bomb is that it will not be destroyed by counter bombs, even as violence cannot be by counter violence. Mankind has to get out of violence only through nonviolence. Hatred can be overcome only by love. Counter hatred only increases the surface as well as the depth of hatred. And he explained how social transformation will come from the bottom up. He said, we have to make truth and nonviolence not matters for mere individual practice, but for practice by groups and communities and nations. Before general disarmament commences, some nation will have to dare to disarm herself and take large risks. The level of nonviolence in that nation, if that event happily comes to pass, will naturally have risen so high as to command universal self-respect. Her judgment will be unerring, her decisions firm, her capacity for heroic self-sacrifice will be great, and she will want to live as much for other nations as for herself. Now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Terry Rockefeller. Terry is with September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, and she is the other UFPJ National Co-Convener, and she will moderate the Q&A session. And I'd also like to acknowledge Carly Town with Code Pink, also a member of the UFPJ Coordinating Committee, who is handling tech behind the scenes. So Terry?
Thank you, Jackie. First of all, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to all of our panelists for, I think, what clearly, if you look at the chat, generated a lot of thought, a huge amount of appreciation. I'm going to just field what seemed to be one of the simpler questions, and I know it's not going to have a simple answer, but what are the prospects for the August 2021 NPT Review Conference? What are the things that we might hope will come out of it? And what are the things that we should expect? And that was to everyone.
Well, I can take a shot at that. I think the answer is unclear. There's going to be some tendency for countries to want to sort of encourage the United States in its return to some measure of support for nuclear arms control and for multilateralism. On the other hand, the non-nuclear weapon states have become increasingly adamant, as demonstrated not only, but as demonstrated by the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So there's going to be two sort of opposing factors. And there's also going to be some interest in reaching an outcome, because the last outcome that was reached by a review conference, they take place every 5 years ago. Every 5 years, the last one was where an agreement was reached was in 2010. But my last comment would be just that the importance of having an outcome in and of itself should not be overestimated. One of the problems with the NPT review process is that there have been excellent commitments, somewhat vague, somewhat general, but still good commitments made in 1995, 2000, and 2010, and they have not been implemented.
I'd
So-
just like to add something to that, which is that I think this announcement just last week from the UK, that they're going to increase the size of their arsenal and replace their weapons, their warheads and delivery systems, is a potential game changer, because UK has always positioned itself as the most reasonable, nuclear armed state with the smallest arsenal and really enabling progress and so on. And this is just flat out a repudiation of their Article 6 commitment.
So, I have to say that having watched the chat, having watched the Q&A, overwhelmingly, the concern that the participants tonight have had is, how do we build a mass citizens movement? How do we get the scientists and the people to collaborate in building a movement? What do we think about the opportunities for religious communities' involvement, for a massive public education effort? What are your concerns about how the government has suppressed knowledge about the real impacts of the use of atomic bombs? What about the growing role of youth? I am putting this all together, and I will let each of you choose how to respond. And I think lastly, how do we actually make nuclear abolition an issue of US political debate and discourse? So I can't tell you, and I want to express great appreciation for so many intelligent things that people have put in the Q&A and in the discussion. And perhaps as you take turns, perhaps each of you could speak to this. Andy, there was specifically a request that you speak a bit more about the changing nature of trying to quote from someone, and I'm not finding it, but the changing nature of the new nature of the military industrial complex today. That's shorthand, but I let you take that up in order. I mean, this was the overwhelming interest of all of their participants, is this people's movement that we need to build.
Well, I'll take a shot at it. I mean, none of us knows the answer, okay? It's an unanswerable question. That's the first thing. So we have to ask the questions to get to the answer to the question. But I fervently believe we cannot win it as a single issue. We cannot build a movement around this single issue. Even as we speak, nuclear weapons are being eclipsed in the evil, crazy minds of the military by their dream high-tech artificial intelligence, automated weapons. I watched a the future defense thing with a bunch of eminent military and ex-military experts, and it was an hour and a half, and none of them mentioned nuclear weapons. So, I mean, this is crazy. But so we can't be preaching to other movements to say you should be concerned about this. We need to show up. We just need to show up. I have personally been actively supporting the Fight for 15 within the Poor People's Campaign. And I feel in my gut that's part of my anti-nuclear work, because we have to change the values and the system in order to crack this code. And so somehow we need to get our arms around our common values, recognize the dignity and worth of each person, whether or not they're working on our issue, and find ways to work together. And that's why I'm so excited about the Poor People's Campaign. And I do think that so far, but the co-chairs, Reverend Theo Harris and Reverend Barber, have both spoken at anti-nuclear conferences, virtually, of course. They're open to it. They know it's a big issue. And so it's a matter of, we all have to figure out how to work together in this moral fusion way. And that's the best answer I can give. It's not going to be the way it was. We don't have a magic recipe. And the other thing I will say is that a sort of chicken and egg problem there is, how do we make nuclear weapons in even the top 3 or 4 priorities that people have? It's just not there. That's why it didn't show up in the presidential campaign.
I'll address the military industrial complex issue first, mainly by noting that if you go to that link to the post on the website of United for Peace and Justice, I have a working paper there called Rethinking the Military Industrial Complex that goes into some of these issues in considerably more depth. You know, the main thing I was trying to get people to think about is what kind of a role does the military industrial complex play today in driving a foreign policy very much centered on the threat and use of military force? And to what extent are other more systemic drivers at play? It matters whether, you know, where we put our time and energy and what we think about, whether we think that mainly this is a matter of a few profit-driven interests, or whether we think it's more a product of the kinds of forces I was talking about in the latter half of my talk, that you have once more the people who really control the governments and militaries of great powers are engaged in a kind of competition for dominance in the leading technologies, for markets, for resources, and so forth, where they are also going to be competing directly with each other militarily. In other words, there's a lot of demand for military force. And just generally speaking, it's important to remember that when you have a global system, which is extraordinarily inequitable both within and among countries, there's going to be a tremendous demand by those who benefit from the system for a whole lot of organized state violence. And in terms of building the movements, you know, one of the things that happens during very long periods when there aren't big, sustained, mobilized movements is the horizons of our political imagination shrinks. And another thing that happens is that politics gets professionalized. In a country like this, it gets reduced largely to single issue advocacy focused on government officials, centers of power, legislatures, and really with a horizon of possibility that doesn't extend beyond what people think is possible in the next year or two in Congress or some other legislative setting or executive setting. And so I think one of the main things we have to do is really make an effort to expand the horizons of our political imagination and to think of things to do, because we don't have, I believe we don't have anywhere near the social power we need to have a real impact on reducing the risk of war, and making progress happen towards nuclear disarmament. So we have to think of things to do that are not deploying really meager social power we already have to try to get governments to do things. And instead, how do we reach out to other people to try to get a far larger and more unified movement together? And it may not be just, again, a movement about nuclear weapons. And so we have to start thinking about how are our issues connected on the level of root causes. That's the main place I believe that the conversation has to take place. And so, generally what I've, a lot of my efforts for the last couple of years have been sort of going through the various discourses that are relevant to nuclear disarmament and thinking, how do we shift the focus from an emphasis on causes to, or rather an emphasis on effects, to more of an emphasis on understanding the root causes?
Whenever I hear Jackie quote Martin Luther King, I am struck by how naturally and easily he talked about issues facing Americans with issues facing people all over the world. And that's, that's what we need, and it's possible. And anybody who's paying attention to the pandemic knows it's not just a problem in the US, it's a global problem. They're paying attention on climate, they know it's a global problem. It's not just a US problem. And while it is true that the United States could unilaterally disarm, I think the reality is that nuclear weapons are really a global problem. Like the others, they're going to require global solutions. So I think we need to work again at making these kind of global dimensions a very kind of natural and ordinary part of our political advocacy.
Let me add just 2 points, Terry, because you mentioned, somebody asked about youth, and I do want to acknowledge that there are several new formations of youth who are taking this up. One of them is Reverse the Trend, and somebody from Reverse the Trend is on this call, which is actually specifically linking nuclear weapons and climate change issues for young people. The other is the Abolition 2000 Youth Fusion Network, which is an international network of young people, again, seeking to make common cause with youth who are concerned about other issues. And in their case, something I really appreciate, which is they have an intergenerational dialogue project going so that young activists can, talk to older folks like us and, might see if there's anything worth learning from us and see if there's anything we can learn from them. The other is that I want to get to actually give people something to do to understand more deeply Martin Luther King's analysis. And there on April 4th is the anniversary of his assassination, but just a year to the day before his assassination, he delivered a really amazing speech called Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. The quote that I read was from that speech. And on the UFPJ website under our resources, Martin Luther King resources, the speech is there, and also how to organize a local participatory reading of it. And I recommend that everybody read that speech or listen to him deliver that speech if you haven't already. Just substitute the names of the countries and it's all there.
Well, thank you, Jackie. You actually anticipated the next question I was going to put out. I'd say there's been another, collective interest, and I'm going to ask people for very short comments so that we don't run too far past the hour, but we started a couple of minutes late. People are interested in what are the forces that are inspiring multinationalism today? And, you know, clearly the pandemic is one, clearly the climate change movement is another. And what are the potential of for that new energy in the world? And a number of people have mentioned the Secretary General and how he called for an end to war in response to the pandemic. Where could that take us? Let's leave it on a positive note.
Well, it is certainly true that the UN Secretary General has been outspoken on the need for nuclear disarmament, climate protection, a global ceasefire. And I think there's some tendency for Americans, basically due to decades of what shall I call it, propaganda, to undervalue the United Nations. So we should fight against that. And take the opportunity to go on the UN website and look at what the Office for Disarmament Affairs is up to. Look at what the Secretary General is saying. And one of the things that I try to do is take the things we've been talking about and get that discussion into mainstream institutions like Rotary International, like the New York City Bar Association. And one thing I've noticed is there's actually quite a lot of interest in responsiveness regarding what the UN has to say about things. So I think it's a resource that we need to make more use of.
Well,
Let-
a final comment, and then
Well, sure. I want to say if you know, especially, I mean, I know we all have Zoom fatigue, but it is possible to meet with people all over the world all the time now. And let me put in a plug for Mayors for Peace. Mayors for Peace is an international network of over 8,000 cities in 165 countries, led by the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it has also kind of embraced this broader approach. It has two main pillars, calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons and supporting the creation of safe and resilient cities as two essential things that need to happen to achieve world peace. So it takes into account a lot of different kinds of activities in cities around the world, and we only have 218 U.S. members, and there are over 1,000 in Iran. So I would like to invite folks to find out if your mayor is a member and recruit your mayor. And if you're going to your city councils with resolutions on Back from the Brink or the city's appeal, also try to enroll your mayor at the time. And I am available to consult with people about that.
so we're a little bit past our cutoff time. I want to thank each of our panelists. I really want to thank our participants because everyone who was here, I mean, the chat is just rich with thoughts and experiences, and we look forward to future webinars like this. This was recorded. It will be posted on the UFPJ website, and everyone who was here tonight will receive that link. We encourage you to share the recording widely with your colleagues, and we encourage you to come back and attend future UFPJ webinars. So thank you to everyone. Have a good evening, and we hope to see you again soon.